morning, and welcome to Coastal Conversations, a new show here on WERU. We explore issues facing Maine's coastal communities through dialogue with people who live, work, and play on our coast. From fisheries to tourism, from energy to environment, from economy to ecology, we go beyond the social media soundbites, probing deeply into complex issues and solutions. Coastal Conversations is produced with help from the University of Maine's Sea Grant program, whose mission is to support Maine's coastal communities through research, outreach, and education. In partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the University of Maine, Maine Sea Grant brings marine science to Maine people. We're about to engage in the heart and soul of community radio, in which those of us in the studio and you who are listening create a dialogue that we hope will be of benefit to our coast and our communities. This is Natalie Springuel, and I hope you'll stay with us for the next hour of Coastal Conversations. This morning, our topic is green crabs, invasion, impact, and opportunities. Our guests today are Beal from the University of Maine at Machias and the Downeast Institute for Applied Marine Research and Education on Beals Island, Bowden from the Penobscot Shellfish Conservation Committee, and Hannah Annis, an area biologist from the Maine Department of Marine Resources. We're going to start with Brian. Brian, are you on the line?
I am. Hi, Natalie. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us, Brian. It's great to have you.
Sure.
Brian, let's start at the basics. Well, actually, let's start with introducing you first. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the University of Maine at Machias and what the Downeast Institute is all about.
Sure. I have a half-time teaching and half-time research appointment here at UMM. I teach courses in marine biology, marine ecology, oceanography, and statistics. I do my research on commercially important marine species. It could be soft-shell clams, it could be green crabs, sea urchins, hard clams, etc., sea scallops. And that work is done through the Downeast Institute, which is UMM's marine field station, where we do a variety of things in terms of culturing organisms. We culture soft-shell clams and work with communities to enhance stocks of their clams with cultured seed. But we also do experiments with them as well as other bivalves that we are growing at the time. So I guess that does it in a nutshell here.
Great. Thanks. Now, the topic of our show today is green crabs, and there's clearly a big connection between green crabs and shellfish, which we'll get to in a minute. But tell us a little bit about green crabs. I think most folks alive today on the coast of Maine have had green crabs on the shore, might have seen them their whole life, but they're actually not native to this region, is my understanding. Tell us a little bit about how they got here, what the population is like.
Sure. Well, how they got here is through the ballast of ships during the early 1800s. It's thought that they landed somewhere around Long Island Sound around 1817, before Maine became a state, and that gradually they made their way both north and south using the same kind of aspects of how they got here from the British Isles to transport themselves, if you will, both north and south. They reached Casco Bay by 1905. So this is we're calling this the 110th anniversary of green crabs in Maine. They made it to eastern Maine, Washington County, Jonesport, Lubec area around the mid-1950s, but they really hadn't been seen before then. And they kind of bucked the tide to get there, since the net movement of the tide is from eastern Maine towards southwestern Maine. And so they did that. They moved gradually north and east along the coast through, again, marine transportation, as they did when they came over from the British Isles.
And so 110 years, that's a chunk of time. Why are we worried about green crabs today?
Well, that's a great question. We're worried about green crabs because gradually their populations have grown. And in 2011, 2012 timeframe, they seemed to explode to a point where, it wasn't just the occasional green crab that people were seeing, but they were seeing just populations and densities of these animals that they hadn't seen really, or they hadn't paid much attention to in their lifetime. This sort of thing happened a population explosion of green crabs at least once before in the 1950s. Sometime around 1951 through 1953, a very, very similar outbreak or explosion in their populations occurred, and it generated an awful lot of concern at that time with, what do we do? How do we deal with them? But the late 1950s and early 1960s were a time of very, very cold winters, year after year after year, and it seemed that the populations of green crabs declined as those winters became more and more severe. So we're kind of hoping that that might be the case this year as well as some of last year as well.
Why do we think that they explode to begin with? Is there any information, any knowledge on that, or is it still all in research stage?
Well, Natalie, what's funny is that there's no one really out there who's studying green crabs specifically, nor has there been for as long as I know. It's one of these things that it's an invasive species. It's in the marine environment. It's been there forever. Who's interested in it? It really doesn't have any commercial aspects that we know about in terms of how people looked at it, 5-10 years ago. Now that there's a larger population around, some folks are saying, well, geez, can we actually do something with this commercially? But, before now, really, we'd all looked at, myself included, as, well, this is a nuisance, but what are you going to do? So no one really knows then for certain why the populations have exploded, other than there seems to be a really good correlation between water temperature and green crab population numbers, especially water temperatures that are the minimum and the maximum for a given year. So, for example, when the maximum water temperatures, hit into the high 50s and mid 60s, that's really a time when green crabs are going to do very well, and even when water temperatures go higher than that. They don't seem to do very well when we get average, minimum monthly temperatures in the wintertime of 34, 35, 32 degrees. They don't seem to do very well. So those are just correlations. They're not cause and effect per se, because no one really has looked at it specifically. Now, people have looked at the physiology of green crabs and have found that they're very, very hardy at the maximum kinds of temperatures that we see, and they do very well even in cold waters. Some studies have been done that have shown that green crabs survive just fine when water temperatures go below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So
wow.
they are the ultimate invader.
Yeah, it sounds like they're able to adapt to a variety of different conditions. Where is their sort of preferred habitat? Are they intertidal, subtidal, further out?
That's what makes them so ubiquitous. They are everywhere. They're subtidal. They're intertidal. They're in marshes. They burrow into soft sediments. They crawl under rocks. And in each one of those habitats, whether it's intertidal, subtidal, rocky, or mud, they're eating a variety of organisms. They're eating clams. They're eating worms. They're able to actually eat plants, marine algae. If you look at the diet of a green crab, it contains, probably more than 50 species. We've been looking at the diet of green crabs from Freeport in some studies that I've been doing down there with clammers in that community, and we even have found small lobsters in the guts of green crabs. So, wow. They're out there eating what they can get their claws onto, basically.
And what's happening in Freeport? How did you zero in on Freeport as the place to do some of your studies on green crabs?
Well, Freeport was really an inviting town for me to work in, because the community raised some funds a couple of years ago to do some research to find out more about green crabs. And they didn't use any foundation monies or organizational monies. They used monies that was raised by the town council, and so I got really an invitation to come down and work with clammers and learn more about what was going on in that area. So I've been able to extend those that project with some funding from the University of Maine system, as well as a private foundation, and NOAA, the Saltonstall-Kennedy folks, have provided some funds. So now we're actually looking at the dynamics of green crabs in the Harrisicot River, in both subtidal and intertidal habitats.
Okay, and what are you seeing in Freeport and that region?
Yeah, well, so we started in 2013, and it's like a tale of two cities. In 2013, we were getting anywhere between 8 to 10 pounds a trap, whether or not it was fished or soaked for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. The biomass was pretty much the same, and it was consistent from early May through at least the end of September, and then it kind of rose to a little bit more than 10 pounds. In 2014, when we started, it wasn't until August until we got an average of 1 pound a trap. So, there's a huge difference between 10 pounds per trap and 1 pound per trap. Mm-hmm. And we were also finding that the ratios of males to females was pretty similar from 1 year to the next. It was biased towards males, about 70 to 30. And the other interesting fact about 2013 is that when we looked at our samples, we were getting about around 12 crabs per pound in the traps. In every pound, we were getting about 12 crabs.
So it takes about 12 crabs to make a pound.
Okay. But in 2014, it took about 40.
Oh, okay.
So the crabs were much larger in 2013. The crabs were much smaller in 2014, but the numbers of crabs in both years was almost the same. Huh. So, yeah, the green crabs, and everyone knows how cold the December was of 2013 into January of 2013, and obviously this year we know how cold it's been. But the point is that the cold weather that we had during that December-January snap, 2013 and 2014, doesn't seem like it pushed their populations to a very low level. It did something to the size distribution, but it didn't reduce numbers.
And what are you seeing that they're eating? You mentioned that they eat all kinds of different things.
Yeah. Well, in the guts that we've examined, we've seen crushed up shell of soft-shell clams. We've seen, not a lot, but we have seen lobsters. We've seen the seedy, the bristles of polychaete worms. We've seen a lot of goo that is digestible material that we can't identify. We've seen some Spartina, some plants that live in the marsh. We've seen pieces of macroalgae like the rockweed and things like that. So we know that what the literature tells us in terms of their breadth of their diet is true, and we've seen that from our samples in Freeport.
So they live in a wide variety of different habitats and at different temperatures, and they eat a whole bunch of different things.
Yes.
So they're really the recipe for an invasive species.
Yes, they are the recipe for disaster.
Uh-huh.
They really are. And when people think, geez, nothing eats green crabs because they're an invasive species, that's as far from the truth as can be. Everything eats green crabs.
Okay.
Seagulls eat green crabs. Green crabs eat green crabs. Lobsters eat green crabs. Rock crabs eat green crabs. Fish eat green crabs. It's just that their reproductive abilities far outweigh any kind of consumer that can try to keep them in check. And so that's what happens. Consumers are not keeping them in check. The only thing that really is keeping them in check, it seems, is the weather.
Is temperature of the water. And what's the basic life cycle of the green crab?
Yeah. So it looks like, and this is from information from a fellow named Beal that worked in Maine around the mid 1980s, who actually did a study. I think it's the only one that I can find that's been published in Maine. But what he found was that green crabs in Maine have a 7 to 8 year life cycle. They can reproduce 2 to 3 times during that cycle. They're reproducing when they shed, and they're shedding in June, July, August, and so they're mating then. The eggs are internal for a few months, and then they they come out on the abdomen of the female. They're extruded just like a lobster. They're extruded on the abdomen of the female, and they will appear sometime between March and May of the following year, and then those eggs will develop, and they will be released sometime in June, July time frame. They'll be planktonic. The eggs will be planktonic. The larvae will be planktonic for maybe about a month, and then they'll settle at sizes of around a millimeter sometime in late September, early October, and November. And as soon as they settle, and this is the thing that most people don't understand, once they settle, they're just a predatory machine. So the 1 millimeter animals that you really need a microscope to really see, they're out there feeding on the soft shell clams that have just settled, that are a fifth of a millimeter. So a 1 millimeter green crab is 5 times larger than its prey, a soft shell clam, and so they're just there's a war going on out there at the microscopic level that really sets the tone for commercial harvests of soft shell clams. Everyone thinks, well, there's a 1-inch clam, and they see that a green crab has consumed it, and that there's a 50 millimeter green crab, a 2-inch green crab, and it's preying on clams that are an inch or inch and a half, and certainly those crabs have a huge impact on clam populations, but nowhere near the kind of impact that thousands and hundreds of millions of these 1 millimeter green crabs that are settling to the flats in the fall and that are preying on soft shell clams that are also settling. It's a war between the growth of green crabs and the growth of soft shell clams. Which species can grow the fastest and get large enough so that they can win this war with the green crab? It's like a murder mystery. It's really interesting.
Wow. And I know that you've been studying the soft-shell clams for decades, maybe, certainly a number of years. I'm wondering if you could just tell us what you're seeing in terms of clam population changes that you think might be attributed to the green crab.
Well, I have been studying soft-shell clam populations for a long time. But most of my focus has been here in eastern Maine, essentially between Lubec and Jonesport in the Beals Island area. I have ventured out and worked in places like Castine and Rockport and Wells and Kittery and things like that. But I haven't done the long-term sorts of projects that I have in Downeast, simply because it's a long way to go. But what I've seen down here recently is I'd say since around 2007, maybe 2005, that when I've put out soft-shell clams that we've raised at the Downeast Institute, and these are field studies that I do annually with my classes here at UMM. I've been finding that the mortality rate of clams has actually increased to a level where even sometimes protecting them with flexible netting that always used to work doesn't, and it doesn't because the apertures on the nets that I'm using are 1/6 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. Well, gee, that doesn't keep those 1 millimeter crabs from crawling in and then basically shedding and then growing up to a size where now they're locked in, they can't get out, and so they prey on clams that are within the protected areas. So, I'd say in the 1990s and early 2000s, if I put out clams and protected them, and when I say put out clams, I'm talking about clams that are 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 an inch in size. If I put netting over them, I could get somewhere between 70 and 80% to survive. And then, against that, the ones that weren't protected, maybe 20% would survive. Well, since 2006, 2007 time frame, even when I put netting on, I might get 30 to 50% to survive. And if there's no net, maybe 2% to survive. So
Wow.
I've seen, a huge difference in the survival of these clams. And, it goes for wild clams as well, because wild clams settle into my plots as well, and their fate is sealed when green crabs are around as well.
Wow. Before we let you go, two sort of wrap-up questions for you. One is sort of what do you see as the sort of biggest needs in terms of addressing green crab, and then also if there's students out there who are listening or other folks who would like to hear more about the work that you're doing or be a student of yours, how they might be able to get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, I'm convinced that the only way that we're going to get out of the green crab problem is to eat our way out of it.
Huh.
And I think that means that either we develop markets that and find markets where people who are accustomed to eating, what we might consider in our normal diet something weird. I mean, I've been to Japan, and I've seen how the Japanese market things like the mantle of scallops, something that no one else would ever even think of considering eating. They kind of put a sugar coating on it, and they package it up, and it's kind of like candy. And then, other parts of the scallop are also eaten and consumed. I'm thinking that, something less than an inch green crab could be baked in some, delicious seasoning coating put on it or baked into it, and you eat it like a potato chip or something. I don't know that I would, but I'll bet you that there's someone out there in the world that would. And if we could develop something like that, maybe we could eat our way out of this problem. But
Great.
I don't think we're going to fish our way out of it, and I don't think we're going to make cat food our way out of it. But if folks are interested in learning more about it, I would ask them to get in touch with me here at the University of Maine at Machias. I'm on the UMM website. My number in my office is 207-255-1314, or you could reach me at bbeal@maine.edu. That's BBEAL @maine.edu. And thanks again, Natalie, for having me on this morning.
Thank you so much, Brian. Have a great day and good luck with the research.
Okay, thanks. Bye now.
If you're just tuning in, we're listening to Coastal Conversations on WERU 89.9 in Blue Hill and 99.9 in Bangor, and streaming online at weru.org. Our topic this morning is green crabs, invasion, impact, and opportunities. And if you just heard Brian talk, maybe there's some opportunities and some neat food out there for green crab could be turned into. So we just heard from Brian Beal from the University of Maine at Machias and the Downeast Institute for Applied Marine Research and Education, who's been doing all kinds of research related to green crab predation and life cycle and how they impact other species and what they're eating. In the studio with me today, I have two other folks who know a whole lot about green crab, though they reminded me at the beginning that there's still so much we don't know about the species. But I'm joined by Bailey Bowden from Penobscot's Shellfish Conservation Committee. Hi, Bailey.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Thanks for coming. And we also have Hannah Annis, who's an area biologist with the Maine Department of Marine Resources.
Good morning.
Hi, Hannah.
Good morning.
Great. So, Hannah, tell us a little bit about what an area biologist at Department of Marine Resources does.
The main part of what we do is work with municipal shellfish programs. These are programs that were, 1963, the Maine legislature enacted that towns could enact an ordinance that would allow them to have certain controls and activities they could do to manage certain shellfish species in their town. So we work with these towns to help develop the ordinances, walk them through the process, talk about the laws and the regulations, and then help through the paperwork, of course. And then we also participate with them in the field, helping them to do some of the activities that they might do, like reseedings or surveys, enhancement of the resources.
Great. And I know that you spend a lot of time in the field, and you're also attending a lot of municipal shellfish committee meetings and that kind of thing. So we'll make sure to ask you some questions about what you're hearing from people in the field and what you guys are observing out there. Bailey, you're coming at it from the municipal perspective. You're a resident of the town of Penobscot, and you are also the chair of the Penobscot Shellfish Conservation Committee. So tell us a bit about what the Conservation Committee does.
We have tried to increase our resources so we could have a sustainable fishery for our commercial harvesters and our residents. And the green crabs, unfortunately, came in 2012 and ate most of our clams in our community.
And give us a sense of scale. How important was the clam fishery before that? Now, I know that you grew up clamming with your family and have spent a lot of time out on the flats. And there was a significant commercial fishery, if I understand correctly, in Penobscot. So what's the scale of change that you guys have been seeing there?
Right. Prior to 2012, our annual landings were around 150,000 pounds annually. And once the green crabs came in 2012, they wiped out our 750-acre resource of Northern Bay. And we're probably down to under 10,000 pounds annually harvested now.
Wow. So in 1 year, you went from 150,000 to less than 10,000.
In one summer.
In
yes.
one summer. That's a dramatic decline. Hannah, how does that, have you seen that in other communities in the region? Is that a little bit more extreme than what we're seeing?
Well, I think definitely it was definitely extreme what happened in Penobscot. I mean, is a complete wipeout there. I think green crabs are everywhere, as Brian, detailed for us, and I think all towns are experiencing predation in one form or another. I think it was, I don't remember which town it was, but I know it was Chris Heining in southern Maine has been doing clam population surveys, and what they're seeing there is a total collapse, or there's just certain juvenile clam classes are gone. So what it means is those clams that were hopefully going to grow and become available to commercial harvesters are now gone. So I don't know how far spread the impact is like Penobscot's had, but definitely I think all towns are definitely feeling impact here.
Mm-hmm. And Bailey, so it sounds like the decline that you've seen in the clam, I mean, that's just so dramatic, but it seems like you're correlating it pretty definitively to the green crab. Does it feel like a cause and effect?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw the signs of predation, chipped shells, and a lot of divots in the mud where the crabs had burrowed in and dug up the clams. Plus, we could see them. There were just, hundreds of thousands of green crabs scurrying around. And DMR was kind of skeptical if this was happening, and there was a concern that it might be ocean acidification or neoplasia, which is a type of clam leukemia. Okay. So we gathered samples and had those tested for the pH and for the neoplasia, and those tests came back all within normal ranges, which kind of pointed again towards a green crab issue.
And describe for us the marine environment around Penobscot. So are we talking mudflat, rocky shore? What's it like in your waterways?
Right. We have the perfect growing conditions for green crabs. It's a really shallow, warm estuary, and our flats are pretty much 100% soft mud. So the green crab is able to burrow in very easily. They have a harder time digging into gravel or rocky or substrates. But with the soft mud, they can just wiggle their legs and it turns the mud into silt, and they can really go deeply very quickly.
And it's also a perfect habitat for softshell clams.
Right. Very productive shellfish growing area, or it was.
And so the big change that you saw, I think you said was in 2012?
Yes.
And then how did 2013 and 2014 look?
When we tested for the neoplasia and the pH test in 2013, Hannah came down and we took samples, and we needed 40 clams of any size, and it would take an hour to get 40 clams. And prior to this, we were landing 150,000 pounds a year. So that's a huge difference in the population.
Wow.
We did a lot of survey work, and you take a 1 foot by 2 foot square area, and every 100 feet you dig up a sample and sift through all the mud through a window screen. So you're really getting all the small clams, to the mature clams. And we were finding basically no clams.
And paint a picture for us a little bit when you were a kid going out clamming with your family. How much were you, getting? How was it back then in terms of your memories as a child?
Right. There were always clams. I mean, it was cyclical like any other fishery. You have your boom years and years where it's not so good, but nothing like this. I mean,
Wow.
now we're down to almost nothing.
That is just amazing. Hannah, I know that the Department of Marine Resources has conducted, I think, a statewide survey to kind of get a fix on the extent of the problem. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was, how it worked, when it was, and what you found?
Yeah, I'll try to go down through some of the highlights of it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and this report is also available on the department's website, so if anybody wants to go there and read the entire report.
And what's the website?
Let me see here. I brought it with me because I wanted to give that out. The department's website, we have a website for green crabs, and we have a lot of good links. Actually, we actually link to the DEI where Brian works as well, and there's a lot of information you can get from a lot of those links. But the website would be www.maine.gov/DMR/green crabs.
Great.
But yeah, the one-day green crab trap survey, that was something that we worked with Dr. Beal to develop, and then the department coordinated and carried out. And it was to basically conduct a snapshot of the relative abundance and distribution of green crabs along the Maine's coast. And it was also used to increase awareness of green crabs and the problems that they bring. The data was pretty much collected by volunteers, and pretty much, let me see, it pretty much showed that green crabs are everywhere. We conducted it along the Maine coast from August 27th and August 28th, and people were asked to set baited traps in areas that either were currently or recently good clamming areas for them, and in shallow waters, about less than 20 feet at low tide. And then those traps were set, and they soaked for 24 hours and were pulled the next day. And then the haul or the catch was basically measured using 5-gallon buckets. And then from there, we were able to place some scientists from DMR and from Sea Grant with some of the volunteers to take some further biological information, like the size of the crabs, look at the sex ratios, and look at where the females were in reproductive.
And when you say traps, were the volunteers using lobster traps? They using specialized traps?
Yeah, we didn't really, because we knew it was volunteers and it was happening in a pretty quick time period. We didn't put any parameters on that, and we figured lobster traps, where we're a lot of lobstering around the state of Maine, would be pretty accessible to everybody. So I think lobster and crab or modified crab traps were the most widely used as far as the traps go. And I think we had 28 towns participated. 4 types of traps were mainly used. It was lobster, crab, I think modified shrimp, and maybe some modified eel traps. And there might have been some other, some designs that people were interested in just coming up with and trying. The data that was collected and recorded was a little bit inconsistent, so it kind of played into how we looked at the results and interpreted them. But it did show that what a lot of people were saying, that green crabs are everywhere and they're in a population that's detrimental to our our shellfish resources. And so ultimately, I think it validated like a lot of things that Penobscot was seeing and saying that this is a problem. Whereas I think it also brought some realization to others who weren't aware of why, what the predation was and why they were seeing destruction to habitat. So, there was a lot of simple goals, but I think it got to the heart of the matter that green crabs are everywhere in the state of Maine, and they're a massive problem to our commercial resources.
And if in the last year or two, presumably because of the cold winter temperatures, we've seen the crab population maybe not quite as explosive, is it safe to assume that the clam population might come back, or do we not know? Either one of you. This might be we just don't know. There's so much we don't know yet.
Well, there has been some reports, and we have had some observations of a pretty good seed set this year in some places.
And can you explain what a seed set is?
It would be, it's when the clams go through reproductive, and like Brian said, there's a planktonic, and they're floating around, and then when they get a certain size, the juvenile clams start settling down onto the flats, and those are what we call the settlement. It's this year. It's the brand new clams, the 0-year class clams. And we are getting quite a few reports of some substantial sets. What happens is I think the winter might play a little bit on that, how those clams survive, and then we'll have to see what happens this summer as far as what the impact of the green crabs is going to be on that set.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Coastal Conversations on WERU 89.9 in Blue Hill and 99.9 in Bangor. Our topic today is on green crabs, the invasion of green crabs, and the impact that they're having on the coast. And we'll also sort of explore the idea of opportunities related to green crabs, and we can explore if that's the appropriate word or not to use for them. But I did want to say that we'd welcome your calls or for questions or comments. If you would like to chime into this conversation about green crabs, our number here at the station is 1-866-625-9378. That's 1-866-625-WERU. So feel free to call in with any questions or comments that you may have. So opportunities. So Brian, I asked Brian what needs to happen. He suggested, what about if we looked at it as an opportunity for food? Bailey, what do you think? Is that...
They make great fertilizer.
Okay.
That I do know.
Yeah?
But,
have you used it?
Yes. Yeah, I tried some in my compost pile. It works really great.
Okay.
But trying to turn that into a commercial activity is, that's just not going to happen. Not at the scale that we need to get rid of these green crabs, or to at least, knock the population down to a manageable level.
So in your case, did you just collect them and throw them in your compost heap?
Right. Our Shellfish Committee had a special license, which was issued by DMR, to try different trapping techniques and different baits and things like that to see what the population was and what we could do. And we were getting a bushel of green crabs per lobster trap per set.
Wow.
And that would be, you could set your trap in 4 hours and have a bushel. So you didn't have to wait overnight. Yeah, Penobscot was really overrun with green crabs. And
remind us about how big a bushel is.
Is it 2 5-gallon pails.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. I think we have a call. Billy from Augusta, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is extremely interesting. I'm not someone that I did do some clamming when I was younger, but more of a family type thing. So
great.
It's a huge concern, obviously. Is there a way to trap them efficiently, possibly for home farm use as a fertilizer? And how would someone go about getting either a permit, or would you actually need a permit for something like that?
That's a great question, Billy. I was wondering that myself. If you or I could just head down to the shore and harvest some green crabs, either for us or for our commercial business. Hannah, what's the law say right now?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Sure. So there is a law. Regulation. 25.40 for anybody wants to look at that, and. Because of the amount of concern that was coming from towns like Penobscot and Freeport and every place, Brunswick, Frenchman's Bay, every place that was experiencing this huge green crab population, the department went through a rule and adoption and made some changes in that regulation. Because before, lobstermen had to have a separate green crab license, because the commercial license basically is your ability to sell.
Okay.
Right. So lobstermen had to also have a green crab license only to have and keep green crab and sell green crab. And I don't remember what the fee was at that time, like $38. So the department went through some rule-making changes and to try to streamline and make it easier for people to take green crabs out of the environment. So they allowed lobstermen and crab fishermen holders to be able to, take green crab as a bycatch and sell them. There are personal use exemptions, so as long as you don't want to sell those, anybody is allowed, I think there's a special licensing maybe potentially process, but anybody who wants to use them for personal use is allowed to go out there and trap them or, take them under approved methods.
Okay.
And the other thing you need to be mindful of is you have to use approved bait as well. But the best thing to do is if you want to go do that is to contact, work with the department, work with the area biologists and Marine Patrol. And they also reduced the price of the license to $10 for residents and $20 for non-residents. There are some trapping requirements, what the trap needs to be as far as some design requirements on that. But again, Marine Patrol is really helpful in walking through that.
And what are the baits that are being used?
Well, the baits, I think a lot of people at the time were, there are approved baits and not approved baits, but I think people are really trying a whole list of things, whatever they could get their hands on, because as Brian said, green crabs will eat just about anything. A lot of clammers and fishermen were using anything from what lobstermen were using for bait to clams. I've heard, other things. People were throwing their chicken in there.
Uh-huh.
Cans of tuna or sardine. There were all kinds of things tried, but there is a list of approved baits.
Okay.
And again, Marine Patrol are the best people to check to make sure that you're in compliance with those, with those regulations.
Great. And Billy, I just wanted to say thanks for that question. Great question. Bailey, you said that your committee, the Penobscot Shellfish Conservation Committee, got a permit, was it, so that you could harvest the clams? How did that work? What was that process for you?
It was
not clams, crabs.
Crabs, right. It was a special license from DMR, which exempted us from pretty much all the rules, regulations, and laws regarding trapping, just to see. We were on the tip of the spear, I guess, to try and see what the green crab situation was. So we were really collecting biological information for the department. So we were given a little leeway to investigate, really. Hannah,
you mentioned that the laws had changed for lobstermen. I'm curious, from what you two are hearing from lobstermen, how many green crabs are they hauling up in their traps incidentally without targeting green crabs? Are lobstermen seeing a lot of crabs in their traps?
I think Billy. I think Billy can probably add to this too. But it seems like the responses vary. I think depending upon where you're fishing. A lot of the guys that fish close to shore. I've talked to some guys that fish around Frenchman's Bay, and they're fishing close to shore. They're having a hard time keeping their traps baited. The green crabs are coming in and wiping the bait out just as fast as they can bait them and set them. And they weren't seeing as many. This was in the heart of it when things were really bad, and they weren't seeing many there was more green crabs in the traps than lobsters.
Wow.
So I think it was really impacting the guys that fish close to shore. I don't know what the impact was I don't think it was as severe out to sea. I think they were still seeing larger green crabs in deeper waters. I know Billy has some experience here, but I think there were some impacts as far as what they were seeing, close to shore.
Right. In 2013, 2012, and 13 in Penobscot, like I said, we're a shallow water area. The lobstermen were actually displaced. The lobsters were displaced. The rock crab were displaced. It was strictly green crab. Mm-hmm. That's all you could catch. Whether the lobsters actually left or if they were just outcompeted, if the green crabs just outcompeted the lobster for the food in the trap, we really don't know. But all you could catch was a green crab. And now that we have no more shellfish, we don't have any mussels. The periwinkle supply has gone down. The eelgrass has been destroyed. The green crabs seem to have left because there's nothing left to eat. And we're starting to see rock crab and lobsters again. They came back almost immediately.
Huh. Can one of you describe what a green crab looks like for someone who may not know which crab we're seeing, how it compares to rock crab and Jonah crab?
Well, I know the lot of identification that we tell people is that when you look at a green crab, if you're looking from the top, if you're looking down the top of the crab, on either side of the eyes, there'll be 5 prominent points. And then between the eyes, there are 3 rounded points. They're generally green, but not always. Their color may change depending upon where they are in the molt and reproductive stages. And the back flippers are maybe a little bit thinner because they are related to the blue crab.
Okay.
I don't know if Bailey has anything he wants to add, but that's kind of how we've been explaining it to folks.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest way. Those 5 spines on the side of the shell, that's the easiest way to tell, for me anyway.
And is it safe to say that if you're roaming around the intertidal zone, the shore, and you see a crab, chances are better that it's going to be a green crab than a rock or a Jonah because they're more subtidal? Is that correct?
That's what I would say, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'm curious if, so it sounds like DMR is already changing the regulations a little bit, and the legislatures are also changing the regulations to make it easier to harvest green crabs. Would it ever become a managed fishery?
Hopefully, if Pat's listening, I hope I get this right, our commissioner. I did a little bit of reading before I came today, and I did find when we had the Green Crab Summit, I think it was in 2013 as well, and I did see a quote from Pat that said that obviously the department's interested in listening to ideas about advancing economic opportunities, but when it's all said and done, the department does not want to manage such a disastrous invasive species. Manage them for a sustainable fishery.
Yeah, it seems like that would be pretty complicated and trigger potentially. I don't know how that would work. It just seems very tricky.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky situation because it makes it hard, I think, for commercial markets to pop up and stay if there's not a good source of product. But again, with the impacts that they're having to our native important commercial species, I think it's safe to say the department's not interested in managing them for sustainable fishery.
Yeah, the priority is protect our existing fisheries.
Yeah, I think we'd like to see them. I mean, I don't know if it's possible, but I think we'd love to see them eradicated. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you guys think? Oh, actually, before I go there, I think it was yesterday or the day before, saw a headline from a newspaper in Nova Scotia that was talking about how Nova Scotian lobstermen have been experimenting with using green crabs as lobster bait. What have you heard about that? Have either of you heard about that? Do you know about these experiments?
I just that article was recently shared with me, and from my understanding, there's some researchers that are saying that it looks like the green crab bait is potentially transferring a parasite to lobsters that's weakening their condition and making them more susceptible to predation, or weakening them, potentially death in the processes of handling them between catch and market. It's relatively new, so I don't know a lot more than that about it.
So it sounds like a lot more investigation needs to happen before we encourage lobstermen to think about using them as bait.
Yeah, and I think a lot of questions that come out of that is how is that parasite transferred, and is it through because they're broken in bait, or is it just transferred in general? I mean, I don't think we know enough. I think we definitely need to be looked at further.
Yeah. So Bailey, for the town of Penobscot, what are the next steps? What are you guys going to look at this coming year, and where are you going to head next in terms of thinking about and observing and monitoring green crabs and clams?
Right. Basically, we've just let nature take its course. We didn't have enough manpower, and we really couldn't get approval for any method to do a green crab removal on a large scale. And we our intuitive thinking was once all the food was gone, the green crabs are either going to eat themselves or leave. And that appears to be what has happened, and we are just waiting to see, what's going to happen next. We're afraid that the clam population will recover to some extent, but at that point the green crabs will just come back and devour what is grown in the last year or two. That's our biggest concern. So we're just going to keep an eye out. We're going to do some survey work to see, what the size is, and like Anna said, if we had a good recruitment from the last 2 years, we need to see what our population is, and then just see if it gets eaten by green crabs in the future.
Has any municipality or anyone sort of mounted a larger eradication approach?
Yeah, I mean, historically, like Brian said, green crabs have been around for, he said, 110 years. And, different people have tried things over the years. And it's been proven that barriers such as fencing and netting are definitely effective. The problem with those is that it's intensive, and the scope of trying to fence and net an entire town is pretty restrictive. And I think currently Freeport's doing a lot of work looking at netting and fencing and trapping. And they're, I think looking at the scale of it, what's realistic, what can a town do? And when you look at the scope and scale, some of these towns have tens and hundreds of acres of flats, and you just can't fence and net and trap all of that. It's just not effective. And so I think what, Freeport's looking at is kind of looking at municipal aquaculture. Maybe looking at, it's probably more realistic to fence and trap and net in an acre or two. And then could that supplement some of the wild harvest and take that green by netting and trapping and fencing in those smaller areas that would hopefully reduce the green crab threat and predation there, and again supplement some of the wild harvest as well.
Interesting. And physically, how does netting or fencing work?
Well, it's pretty. The netting is basically just like Browne described. You have a certain size aperture netting, and it's basically going out there and affixing it in the mud. You usually have flotation so it rises when the tide comes in to help with sedimentation and to create kind of the same effects as rocks or structures on the flats. There's some of the eddying effects to encourage clams spat to settle out there. And then, once the netting is set, you have to kind of have a maintenance schedule, go back and check on it to make sure the sedimentation isn't taking over and actually suffocating. Checking them a couple of times a month to make sure that there's no rips or tears or that the nets aren't lifting up so green crabs and other predators can't get in there, and try to reduce that.
So the net is not as much about keeping green crabs out, but it's providing substrate for the clams to settle.
Well, no, I think it's an excluding type. So yeah,
okay.
it's helping to keep green crabs out. That's what you want to do, is keep the green crabs out, protect what's there, maybe encourage more clams to settle out underneath of it, and then give them more opportunity to grow and to feed and grow without constantly being attacked by the predators. And then fencing is a little bit different. Fencing is actually like what you would see in people's yards. It's not as far as looks, but it's erect fencing. And again, it's meant to, it'll stand up in the water column, and it's meant, again, to try to make it difficult or exclude green crabs from an area. And again, you have to maintain that through keeping, sometimes logs will float in or keeping debris out of that and keeping that in the mud. And then, of course, you could trap inside of those fenced areas to try to help, again, remove any green crabs that might try to get in. Because I've had lobstermen tell me they've seen green crabs swim and pretty good at it. So I think that, I think towns need to look at how they're managing. We've been doing a lot of the same things for years, but, sometimes you have to adapt to changing situations. And this could definitely be a potentially positive, tool for the towns to look at, municipal leasing.
Bailey, have you guys thought about that?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention was, I think it was in 2010, Hannah came down to Penobscot and helped us with an experiment where we were trying to capture clam spat and encourage settlement of the wild spat. And we took lobster trap doors, which are 16 inches by 3 foot or something like that, of lobster mesh of wire. And we wrapped that with 1 layer, 2 layer, and 3 layers of 1/4-inch plastic mesh netting. And we stood that arrangement in the mud vertically and tried to capture the seed and see what we would get. And what we found was we captured hundreds and hundreds of clam seed, and they grew to 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, but our survival rate was 0. And what we noticed inside the mesh were these little 1/4-inch to 3/8 inch green crab that had settled inside underneath the mesh, just like Dr. Beal was talking. And they grew up proportionally to the size of the immature juvenile clam.
And this was before or at the front end of the recent explosion.
Right. This is before we knew we had a problem. We also noticed that a lot of clams had a drill hole in them, and we had a moon snail problem, which is another predator. So in 2011, we really went out and we're looking at the moon snail population and collecting, and I think we got like 7,500 of the collars, which is the egg case that moon snails lay, and we removed 500 or 600 moon snails.
Wow.
They were everywhere. And when 2012 came, there were no moon snails and no egg collars, and we kind of said, hey, what happened? We didn't get rid of all the moon snails. What's going on? And that's when we realized that apparently the green crabs ate the moon snails before they ate the clams.
Wow. And the moon snails are the fairly large, very round snails.
Right. Actually, we have a weird species. I think it's the striped moon snail.
Yeah, a banded or spotted.
Right, banded moon snail, which is a lot smaller. It's probably 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Not the big 2-inch moon snail.
And Bailey, for other towns who are maybe not quite cluing into the extremity of the problem or haven't experienced it quite to the degree that Penobscot has, what would you recommend that other shellfish committees sort of pay attention to and look at?
Yeah, they should look for signs of predation in their soft bottom growing areas, like in the muddy areas. The gravel and rocky area isn't such a big deal, but if you're seeing signs in the muddy areas, you may want to try to do some trapping or fencing or get a hold of DMR or Dr. Beal to see what could be done.
Okay, great. And what do you think the prognosis is for the future?
I'm not really optimistic. I don't think this cold weather is doing much. I think it may take out a size class, but it's going to take a really huge effort to get rid of these green crabs.
How about you, Hannah? What do you see as the prognosis for the future on green crabs?
Well, I think we need to keep pushing the issue. I think we can't let it die because history has already repeated itself a couple of times here, and it's having some devastating economic impacts to the shellfish industry. And the shellfish industry is very important to the state of Maine. So, I think towns need to, we need to continue to look at education and outreach. We need to keep studying the issue, and I think hopefully towns need to keep. Sometimes you can do things and sometimes you can't, but, hopefully towns can look at some other tools they might be able to apply, maybe diversify the shellfish species beyond, because they can manage more than just soft-shell clams. So maybe it's looking at some other resources they can bring in, looking at municipal aquaculture, continuing to survey the resources and keep an eye on things. And, there are places where these things are effective. It's just a matter of applying them appropriately. And so, I agree with Bailey. I think we can't rely upon cold Maine winters to take care of the problem. Hopefully it's helping. But, I think we all need to keep a diligent eye on this and keep pursuing options on what we can do here.
Thank you. Great. Well, we've come to the end of our coastal conversation today about green crabs, and I'd like to thank our guests for their time and good work. Our guests today have been Brian Beal from the University of Maine at Machias and the Downeast Institute for Applied Marine Research and Education, Bailey Bowden from the Penobscot Shellfish Conservation Committee, and Hannah Annis, area biologist with the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And thanks also to Chris Bartlett from the University of Maine Sea Grant and Cooperative Extension for helping compile this show on green crabs. Thanks also to those who listened and called in with your questions and experience. Coastal Conversations is produced with support from the Maine Sea Grant Program at the University of Maine, bringing marine science to Maine people. Join us from 10 to 11 a.m. on the fourth Friday of each month. On the second Friday of each month, you can still catch Talk of the Towns, the long-standing WERU public affairs program that inspired Coastal Conversations. Our show's theme music, A Following Sea, was composed and performed by Paul Anderson. Thanks to Amy Browne for engineering our program, and stay tuned for On the Wing with Joel Raymond. This is Natalie Springuel, host of Coastal Conversations, wishing you a good morning.